Hi, I'm Charlotte. You are watching The Ugly Atheist, and I have today's episode is going to be about this article that I came across recently that seems to suggest that when blind people, and they did interview or collect data on some people, blind people who are actually born blind, so they have no visual references. But the article suggests that people who are blind and who are born blind can have a visual experience when having a near-death event or an out-of-body experience. So they reportedly can see things when they've are clinically deceased, and they are able to describe the surroundings, the things around them. They're able to describe the people and the doctors and the hospital's rooms and all the different aspects of the scenario that they're in, and they're also able to describe visually what they saw when they went up to heaven or wherever they reportedly had gone, and the different beings and past relatives that they interact with, and they're able to recognize them visually. So we're going to explore this article, and I will put it up on the screen here because it's fascinating to say the least. So let's see. This article by Kenneth Ring, Dr. Kenneth Ring, and then Sharon Cooper from the University of Connecticut. It's entitled Near-Death and Out-of-Body Experiences in the Blind, a Study of Apparent Eyeless Vision. So they have they were able to gather a group of people who are both born blind and who became blind early in their life, early adulthood. And they narrowed it down to 31 participants, and these are people who have had near-death experiences or out-of-body experiences or both. And you can see the date on this here is 1997, which is a while ago, but it's still, I think this information still holds true or is valid. So let's see. I highlighted, well, first of all, this article is in I put a link to this article in the description, so you can read this in more depth on your own time. It's a rather involved article, but it is fascinating, and we'll go over what conclusions they came to regarding this phenomenon. I have a quote from William Blake. Okay, that wasn't necessary. So here's the first thing I highlighted. I went through this article and highlighted some of the few things I wanted to talk about during this episode, although we won't have time to go over all of them. So we'll see how much we can get through here. There are reported cases where individuals who are blind because of medically confirmed organic damage to their optical system could, at the time of clinical death, see the environment. Occurrences of this kind, unlike most of the other aspects of near-death phenomenon, can be subjected to objective verification. They thus represent the most convincing proof that what happens in near-death experiences is more than the hallucinatory phantasmagoria of psychologically impaired brains. So what that's saying is that because the descriptions given by these blind participants pertaining to what visuals they saw during their out-of-body experience or near-death experience can be corroborated, then that lends some degree of credibility to what they're saying, what they're experiencing, that they could perhaps indeed see through spiritual eyes, as it were. So let's scroll down here. Let's see, we have so specifically because people who surgically regain their sight. Okay, this is interesting. So they're saying the people who have in real life regained their sight through surgery it takes their brain a while to understand what this new sensory input is and how that squares with what they're hearing, smelling, and touching. So it what normally would take time to develop in a newly sighted person is apparently instantaneous when they have a out-of-body experience. And so that's kind of interesting in that it might be an indicator as to what's going on with this phenomenon. And we'll go over that shortly. They do have a number of conclusions that they've come to based on these findings, but we'll get into that. Says this is about the subjects that are participating. It says 16 of our respondents had survived a near-death experience, while an additional 5 persons had undergone both a near-death experience and 1 or more out-of-body experiences on other occasions not associated with their near-death incident. Okay. So this is about one of the participants, Vicky Umapeg. So she was one of the few who were born blind, or at least became blind shortly after birth. She was she was born prematurely, and so they put her in an incubator, an airlock incubator that they had. They didn't regulate the oxygen levels in there, and they had the oxygen too high, and it damaged her optic nerve. And so the interviewer asks her, "Could you see anything?" And Vicky says, "Nothing, never, no light, no shadows, no nothing ever." And the interviewer says, "So the optic nerve was destroyed to both eyes?" "Yes. So I've never been able to understand even the concept of light." Vicky, so this is about Vicky's. She was involved in a crash. That is what put her into clinical death. Vicky clearly remembers the frightening prelude to the crash itself, but she has only a hazy recall of finding herself alternately out of her body and then back inside of it at the accident scene. Her only definite recollection of anything external to herself while out of body is a very brief glimpse of the crumpled vehicle. Although this aspect of her experience was confusing, she does claim that while in her out-of-body state, she was aware of being in a non-physical body that had a distinct form and that was, as she put it, like it was made of light. She could overhear their conversation, too, which had to do with their fear that because of the possible damage to Vicky's eardrums, she could become deaf as well as blind. She was also aware of seeing her body below her, which she recognized by certain identifying features, such as this distinctive wedding ring that she was wearing. According to her testimony, Vicky first had a very fleeting image of herself lying on the metal table, and she was sure, she said, that it was me, although it took her a moment to register the fact as certainty. She later told us, "I knew it was me. I was pretty thin then. I was quite tall and thin at that point. And I recognized at first that it was a body, but I didn't even know that it was mine initially. Then I perceived that I was up on the ceiling. I thought, well, that's kind of weird. What am I doing up here? I thought, well, this must be me. Am I dead? I just briefly saw this body, and I knew that it was mine because I wasn't in mine. Then I was just away from it. It was that quick." And then almost immediately after that, she recalls herself going up through the ceiling of the hospital until she was above the roof of the building itself, during which time she had a brief panoramic view of her surroundings. She felt very exhilarated during this ascension and enjoyed tremendously the freedom of movement she was experiencing. She also began to hear sublimely beautiful and exquisite harmonious music, akin to wind chimes. She was surrounded by trees and flowers, a vast number of people. Okay, so this kind of goes into the people that she saw. She was able to see some of her old caretakers, Mr. and Mrs. Zilk, both of whom had passed away previously. Finally, there was Vicky's grandmother, who had essentially raised Vicky and who had died just 2 years before this incident. Her grandmother, who was further back than the others, was reaching out to hug Vicky. In these encounters, no actual words were exchanged, Vicky says, but only feelings of love and welcome. So she probably... Well, I have an opinion of what could be going on here with these people, but let's read a little bit more. Let me see here. So this is about another of the participants, Brad Barrows. Brad remembers that he couldn't breathe any longer. He felt himself lifting up from the bed and floating through the room toward the ceiling. He saw his apparent lifeless body on the bed. He also saw his blind roommate get up from his bed, leave the room to get help. His roommate later confirmed this. Brad then found himself rapidly going upward through the ceiling of the building until he was above the roof. At this point, he found that he could see clearly. He noticed that the sky was cloudy and dark and there had been snowstorms the day before, and Brad could see the snow everywhere except for the streets which had been plowed. Though they were still slushy, he was also able to give us a very detailed description of the way the snow looked. Brad could also see the snowbanks that the plows had created. He saw streetcars, he saw his childhood park he used to play at. When asked if he knew or saw these things, he said, "I clearly visualized them. I could suddenly notice them and see them. I remember being able to see quite clearly." And let us go on here to, this is regarding some of the other participants. One man who we classified as a non-visualizer. So yeah, some of the participants didn't have any visualization at all during their near-death experience, during their near-death experience or out-of-body experience. One of the participants said, "I don't know what you mean by seeing." He was not the only such person to admit such perplexity, so that even among those cases we felt obliged to classify as not involving sight, the possibility is not entirely foreclosed. Yeah, it could be that they just don't know what is meant by sight, and when they had these experiences, they sort of didn't know how to describe them or didn't have words for them. So overall, the number of persons who indicated they had some kind of vision either during the NDE or out-of-body experience was 25. Okay. So I have another one here highlighted. Another man lost his vision in a car accident at the age of 19. He had confirmed vision of his deceased grandmother across a valley during his near-death experience. In commenting on his clarity, he said, "Of course I had no sight because I had total destruction of my eyes in the accident, but my vision was very clear and distinct. I had perfect vision in that experience." Still another man, this one blind from birth, found himself in an enormous library during the transcendental phase of his NDE and saw thousands and millions and billions of books as far as you could see. Asked if he saw them visually, he said, "Oh yes." Did he see them clearly? No problem. He was surprised at being able to see thus. Was he surprised at being able to see thus? Not in the least. I said, "Hey, you can't see." And I said, "Well, of course I can see. Look at those books. That's ample proof that I can see." Typically, vision is reported as clear, even acutely so, by our respondents in the otherworldly domain, whereas seeing is often described as perfectly natural or the way it's supposed to be. However, sometimes the initial onset of visual perception of the physical world is disorienting and even disturbing to the blind. This was true for Vicky, for example, who said, "I had a hard time relating to it. I had a real difficult time relating to it because I've never experienced it, and it was something very foreign to me. Let's see how I can put it in words. It was like hearing words and not being able to understand them, but knowing that they were words, and therefore you'd never heard anything, but it was something new, something you'd not been able to previously attach any meaning to." So now we're going to start getting into some of the hypotheses that are being postulated as to how this phenomenon could be happening. So we have the dream hypothesis, and this one talks about how the idea that these near-death experiences are merely very, very lucid and elaborate dreams. But there's been many studies over the decades of what kinds of dreams blind people have in general, and they don't involve any visuals. Let's see, there's no visual images for people that were born blind. People who were blinded before the age of 5 also tended not to have any visual imagery when they dreamed. And those who became sightless between the age of 5 and 7, they have, and after 7, they they do have some visual imagery, but the clarity tends to fade with time. So their dreams just become more and more visual as time progresses. So this is interesting because I had always thought that when you're dreaming and you reach REM sleep, I've always thought and heard that your brain releases trace amounts of DMT, and that's what creates the visuals that you see when you're dreaming. But what this is suggesting is that the visuals you see upon near-death experience and the visuals that you see when you're dreaming are probably part of two different systems. So they are not connected, and there's some other mechanism that's creating the visuals that you see when you're dreaming. And it could have to do with memory versus any specific neurotransmitter like DMT. But let's move on. This one is about, okay, they interviewed somebody about their dreams. How would you compare your dreams to a near-death experience? Oh, this is Vicky again, and she says, no similarity at all. Interviewer asks, do you have any kind of visual perception in your dreams? And Vicky says, nothing. No color, no sight of any sort, no shadows, no light, no nothing. So here's another hypothesis of what might be going on. We have this retrospective reconstruction, and that is they're not actually, the blind people who are experiencing near-death experiences are not necessarily seeing anything, but when they try to reconstruct the events in their brain, they can only think of it as having seen, because when you try to put an unexplainable experience into words, and into an explanatory format, it's almost like you're forcing that experience into a construct that is not in its nature to be understood through. So it starts to take the form of visuals, and that is the retrospective reconstruction, where you're retelling, you're kind of revising what really happened, and so that it can fit into a context that others can understand, and even yourself can understand. It does not take much information from such sounds for a person to piece together a very convincing and realistic visual impression of what is going on. This will provide the best model they have and seem perfectly real. This one's the most interesting, in my opinion. So it says, in the early 1970s, Lawrence Weisskranz began to study a crucial phenomenon he was later to call blind sight, in which patients suffering from extensive cortical blindness appeared to be able to see in his experiments. In his experiments, for example, Weisskranz was able to show that in the absence of any visual sensation, patients, if asked to reach for a nearby object about whose exact location they were ignorant, tended to move in the right direction. Furthermore, when asked to grasp objects, the nature of which was not disclosed to them beforehand, their hands tended to spontaneously assume the appropriate form necessary to hold that object. Weisskranz's work has been replicated by others, and the phenomenon has even been found in monkeys after extirpation of the visual cortex. So this one is very fascinating in that this article talks about when our retinal tissues are really just another form of skin, and so that, let me see if I can even find a way they describe it here. Skin-based vision, that this idea that we have a kind of eyeless visual backup system based on dermal sensitivity is an old one, although at first blush the notion may seem preposterous. Yet the retina itself is just a specialized piece of skin, through which evolution has come to be the visual specialist for the body. Therefore, it is certainly conceivable that in our skin itself there might be a residual basis for visual detection, which has simply atrophied and become non-functional through disuse, like a vestigial organ. So that might be one explanation for the visual library that would be stored in somebody's brain who was born blind or who could not otherwise see. It says, in general, and quite astonishingly, Romanes reports that his subjects performed remarkably well, far exceeding that what would have been possible by chance. Yeah, I'd like to read that study. Our search for a non-retinal based mechanism that could in principle account for the result of this study has demonstrated that vision in the blind is indeed only apparent and not actual. Let me get into, since we're running out of time, I'll get into what I think is going on here. I think that, so DMT is a very visual neurotransmitter, and it is not inconceivable, I think, that a blind person who spends their life touching everything, smelling and hearing the objects in the world around them, their environment, DMT could very easily use that information. Well, DMT is not using it, but your brain's response to DMT's visual stimulants could use that information to create visuals that seem convincing. And I think this article touched on that a little bit. But in addition to that, I think that even if your eye is damaged, it is still receiving light input. And while the optic nerve is not transmitting that data into the your visual cortex the way it does in a sighted person, I believe that that visual information is being transmitted probably from cell to cell, somehow chemically. It's still being stored by your brain, though it just never reaches your visual cortex. It just is stored in some other part of your brain that I don't know where that would be. But when you dream, it's that part of your brain is not accessed, so the dreams are dark. When the pineal gland releases dimethyltryptamine throughout your brain, those visual references are probably pulled or accessed to create, this is probably how it happens in all of us to some degree, to create the fanciful visions that you see upon death. That is probably what's going on with these people. So in a way they can see, but what I think would be an interesting study is that your ocular organ is in fact relaying information or storing information in your brain. Then I wonder if there's a way to electronically, perhaps using Neuralink or something similar, to tap into that visual storehouse and send those signals into a translator or converter that would send them as neural signals to the visual cortex. So it would bypass your normal nervous system and your normal ocular nerves and just go directly to your visual cortex using wires or electrical conductors. And that might be one way to help restore sight to the blind. And that is, of course, aside from stem cell therapy, where you can regrow somebody's eye and then the accompanying nerves and just pull out the old one and stick in the new one. But all that being said, this is a fascinating topic. The idea that people who are born blind or who became blind early in life are able to have a visual experience when they have a near-death experience, and the fact that your DMT system is separate from your dream system, I feel like I want to look into that more because that's wildly fascinating to me. I've always, as I mentioned before, thought that DMT was responsible for the visuals you see during your REM sleep, but that seems to perhaps not be the case, possibly, at least based on this article. So, because we are limited in time, I'm going to leave this link for you if you want to read this article and come to some conclusions of your own. I believe that there is a naturalistic explanation for this and that there's nothing supernatural about this phenomenon. but you can come to your own conclusions. So I'll leave it there. My name is Charlotte. You are watching The Ugly Atheist, and I hope you enjoyed this content. I appreciate you watching. Please leave a comment. Please like and subscribe, and we'll see you next Sunday.